Section 28, page 138. Not long after their arrival in London, he had run across the Duke of St. Austri, and the Duke instantly did cordially recognizing him. He said, "Look me up, won't you?" But no proper-spirited American would have considered that a suggestion to be acted on, and the meeting was without a sequel. They had even managed to avoid May's English aunt, the banker's wife, who was still in Yorkshire. In fact, they had purposely postponed going to London till the autumn in order that their arrival during that season might not appear pushing and snobbish to these unknown relatives. "Probably there will be nobody at Mrs. Carfry's. London's a desert at this season, and you have made yourself much too beautiful," Archer said to May, who sat at his side, and the handsome, so spotlessly splendid in her sky-blue cloak edged with the swansdown that it seemed wicked to expose her to the London grime. "I don't want them to think that we dress like savages," she replied, with a scorn that Pocahontas might have resented, and he was struck again by the religious reverence of even the most unworldly American woman for the social advantages of dress. It is their armor, he thought, their defense against the unknown, and their defiance of it, and he understood for the first time the earnestness with which May, who was incapable of tying a ribbon in her hair to charm him, had gone through the solemn rite of selecting and ordering her extensive wardrobe. He had been right in expecting the party at Mrs. Carfry's to be a small one. Besides their hostess and her sister, they found, in the long chilly drawing-room, only another shelved lady, a genial vicar, who was her husband, a silent lad, whom Mrs. Carfry named as her nephew, and a small dark gentleman with lively eyes, whom she introduced as his tutor, pronouncing a French name as she did so. Into this dimly light and dim-featured group, May Archer floated like a swan with the sunset on her. She seemed larger, fairer, more voluminously rustling than her husband had ever seen her, and he perceived that the rosiness and rustlingness were the tokens of an extreme and infantile shyness. "What on earth will they expect me to talk about?" Her helpless eyes implored him, at the very moment that her dazzling appreciation was calling forth the same anxiety in their own bosoms. But beauty, even when distrustful of itself, awakens confidence in the manly heart, and the vicar and the French-named tutor were soon manifesting to May their desire to put her at her ease. In spite of their best efforts, however, the dinner was a languishing affair. Archer noticed that his wife's way of showing herself at her ease with foreigners was to become more uncompromisingly local in her references, so that, though her loveliness was an encouragement to admiration, her conversation was a chill to repartee. The vicar soon abandoned the struggle, but the tutor, who spoke the most fluent and accomplished English, gallantly continued to pour it out to her until the ladies, to the manifest relief of all concerned, went to the drawing-room. The vicar, after a glass of port, was obliged to hurry away to a meeting, and the shy nephew, who appeared to be an invalid, was packed off to bed. But Archer and the tutor continued to sit over their wine, and suddenly Archer found himself talking as he had not done since his last symposium with Ned Vincent. The Carfry nephew, it turned out, had been threatened with consumption, and had to leave Harrow for Switzerland, where he had spent 2 years in the milder air of Lake Leman. Being a bookish youth, he had been entrusted to Rivery, who had brought him back to England, and was to remain with him till he went up to the Oxford the following spring. And Mr. Rivery added with simplicity that he should then have to look out for another job. It seemed impossible, Archer thought, that he should be long without one, so varied were his interests and so many his gifts. He was a man of about 30, with a thin ugly face. In parentheses, May would certainly have called him common-looking, to which the play of his ideas gave an intense expressiveness, but there was nothing frivolous or cheap in his animation. His father, who had died young, had filled a small diplomatic post, and it had been intended that the son should follow the same career, but an insatiable taste for letters had thrown the young man into journalism, then into authorship, in parentheses, apparently unsuccessful. And at length, after other experiments and vicissitudes which he spared his listener, into teaching English yachts in Switzerland. Before that, however, he had lived much in Paris, frequented the Goncourt Grenier, been advised by Maupassant not to attempt to write, in parentheses, even that seemed to Archer a dazzling honor, and had often talked with Mary in his mother's house. He had obviously always been desperately pure and anxious, in parentheses, having a mother and an unmarried sister to provide for. And it was apparent that his literary ambitions had failed. His situation, in fact, seemed, materially speaking, no more brilliant than Ned Vincent's, but he had lived in a world in which, as he said, no one who loved ideas need hunger mentally, as it was precisely of that love that poor Vincent was starving to death. Archer looked with a sort of vicarious envy at this eager, impecunious young man, who had fared so richly in his poverty. You see, Monceau, it's worth everything, isn't it, to keep one's intellectual liberty, not to enslave one's power of appreciation, one's critical independence. It was because of that I abandoned journalism, and took to so much dollar work, tutoring and private secretaryship. There is a good deal of drudgery, of course, but one preserves one's moral freedom. What we call in French one's connoisseur. And when one hears good talk, one can join in it without compromising any opinions but one's own, or one can listen and answer it inwardly. Ah, good conversation. There is nothing like it, is there? The air of ideas is the only air worth breathing. And so I have never regretted giving up either diplomacy or journalism. Two different forms of the same self-abdication. He fixed his vivid eyes on Archer as he lit another cigarette. Voila, Monsieur, to be able to look life in the face. That's worth living in a garret for, isn't it? But, after all, one must earn enough to pay for the garret, and I confess that to grow old as a private tutor, or a private anything, is almost as chilling to the imagination as a second secretaryship as at Bucharest. Sometimes I feel I must make a plunge, an immense plunge. Do you suppose, for instance, there will be any opening for me in America, in New York? Archer looked at him with startled eyes. New York, for a young man who had frequented the Goncourts and Flaubert, and who thought the life of ideas the only one worth living. He continued to stare at the Riviere perplexedly, wondering how to tell him that his very superiorities and advantages would be the surest hindrance to success. New York, but must it be especially New York? He stammered, utterly unable to imagine what lucrative opening his native city could offer to a young man to whom good conversation appeared to be the only necessity. A sudden flush rose under Rivery's sallow skin. I thought your metropolis is not the intellectual life more active there? He rejoined, then, as if fearing to give his hearer the impression of having asked a favor, he went on hastily. One throws out random suggestions, more to oneself than to the others. In reality, I see no immediate prospect. And rising from his seat, he added, without a trace of constraint, but Miss Carfry will think that I ought to be taking you upstairs. During the homeward drive, Archer pondered deeply on this episode. His hour with Reverie had put new air into his lungs, and his first impulse had been to invite him to dine the next day. But he was beginning to understand why married men did not always immediately yield to their first impulses. That young tutor is an interesting fellow. We had some awfully good talk after dinner about books and things. He threw out tentatively in the hansom. May roused herself from one of the dreamy silences, into which she had read so many meanings before 6 months of marriage had given him to the key to them. The little Frenchman? Wasn't he dreadfully common? She questioned coldly, and he guessed that she nursed a secret disappointment at having been invited out in London to meet a clergyman and a French tutor. The disappointment was not occasioned by the sentiment ordinarily defined as snobbishness, but by old New York's sense of what was due to it when it risked its dignity in foreign lands. If May's parents had entertained the Carfries in Fifth Avenue, they would have offered them something more substantial than a parson and a schoolmaster. But Archer was on edge, and took her up. Come on, where?" he inquired, and she returned with unusual readiness. "Why, I should say anywhere but in his schoolroom. Those people are always awkward in society. But then," she added disarmingly, "I suppose I shouldn't have known if he was clever." Archer disliked her use of the word clever almost as much as her use of the word common. But he was beginning to fear his tendency to dwell on the things he disliked in her. After all, her point of view had always been the same. It was that of all the people he had grown up among, and he had always regarded it as necessary but negligible. Until a few months ago he had never known a nice woman who looked at life differently, and if a man married it must necessarily be among the nice. "Oh, then I won't ask him to dine," he concluded with a laugh. And May echoed, bewildered, "Goodness, ask the Carfries tutor? Well, not on the same name with the Carfries. If you prefer, I shouldn't. But I did rather want another talk with him. He is looking for a job in New York." Her surprise increased with her indifference. He almost fancied that she suspected him of being tainted with foreignness. "A job in New York? What sort of job? People don't have French tutors. What does he want to do?" "Chiefly to enjoy good conversation, I understand," her husband retorted perversely, and she broke into an appreciative laugh. "Oh, Newland, how funny! Isn't that French?" On the whole, he was glad to have that matter settled for him by her refusing to take seriously his wish to invite M. Riviere. Another after-dinner talk would have made it difficult to avoid the question of New York, and the more Archer considered it, the less he was able to fit Miss M. Riviere into any conceivable picture of New York as he knew it. He perceived with a flush of chilling insight that in the future many problems will be thus negatively solved for him. But as he paid the hansom and followed his wife's long train into the house, he took refuge in the comforting platitude that the first 6 months were always the most difficult in marriage. "After that, I suppose we shall have pretty nearly finished rubbing off each other's angles," he reflected. But the worst of it was that May's pressure was already bearing on the very angles whose sharpness he most wanted to keep. End of the section, page 143.